So the fourth lecture and topic is on sustainable sites. That's looking at environmental impacts of the site design and how the site's managed as well. Rainwater management, heat island effect and light pollution, those kind of issues. So I suppose it's worth saying, remember that LEED came out of the US, so that's a location or a context that's particularly sensitive about site issues because they've got so much urban sprawl. They're so reliant on cars and vehicles to get around. There isn't great public transport, etc. So the location and transport category and the sustainable sites category, I suppose, really are the priority in the development of those aligns to the context that they've been developed out of. And the intention behind sustainable sites is to promote protecting undeveloped landscapes and to use water and resources efficiently, have native planting, etc. Basically to reduce any environmental impact that building on a site may have. So that translates into credits that are available for things about site management and site design in terms of how you assess the site and develop the site and the open space, and also environmental impacts to do with rainwater and heat island and light pollution, and then construction issues to do with pollution and construction guidelines. You'll notice that there's a prerequisite here, a required thing that you have to do, so there's no choice, you must do it. And it's also worth mentioning again that the location and transportation category used to be housed within here. So about how you would actually select the project site and those kind of issues that we just looked at in terms of parking and wider access to connections of the surrounding community, etc. used to be housed in here, and then it became important enough and big enough to be a category in its own right. So there are kind of some similar or related issues between sustainable sites and location and transportation credit. Another thing to notice here is this C appearing, the red C, which means it's a credit that's related to the construction phase as well, or there's evidence or something that needs to be done during the construction phase, and we'll deal with those first. As we come across those, I'll just be highlighting them separately within each category because I think it's an important distinction to note that there's stuff that carries through into that phase. I just want to point out again that these credits do change depending on the rating system that you're using, as I've said, but just to re-emphasize that we're kind of going off the new construction one and we're dealing with only those credits because it's kind of the most common approach. But for example, if you look at the difference in even just this category for the new construction at the top, or and that BD&C is building, design and construction, or core and shell, you can see there's an additional credit for core and shell to do with tenant design and construction guidelines. So you can see, again, if you go onto the LEED credit library on the webpage, you can see how these change and as you filter through the different BD&Cs that you could use and different credits that will apply. And sometimes, not in this case, sometimes the actual points that you can get will also vary, and that would be linked to how important that element is within that particular rating system. So this is a prerequisite, as noted before, so that means it's mandatory, you have to do it. And the intention behind it is to reduce the pollution from any construction activity on the site, and to do that by controlling erosion, waterway sedimentation and airborne dust. And in order to control it, the requirement is that you need to have put in place a control plan. So the requirement is to create and implement that in terms of erosion and sedimentation for all construction activities. It must follow this 2012 US EPA construction general permit, the CGP, or some kind of national local equivalent, whichever is more stringent. And those plans need to address the issues in section 2 of that CGP, and that's issues in relation to erosion and sediment control, stabilisation and pollution prevention. And just to briefly summarise what's in that table, so the first part is about erosion and sediment control. So this is where you are basically exposing the bare soil after removing any vegetation or topsoil, and what you want to do is obviously prevent it from eroding away. So you can do that by providing buffers or perimeter controls, or minimizing the track height of the sediment, and also controlling any discharges from stockpiles, soil like dust or etc. And then in terms of stabilization, you need to have deadlines for initiating and completing the stabilization and the criteria for stabilizing the soil. Um, pre- Prevent the pollution. So there's a list of prohibited discharges, there's general maintenance, there's pollution prevention, fertilizer discharge restrictions. So you can see here everything to do with that could possibly be connected with erosion and sediment control. And then there's also a section on going through site inspections and what's entailed. In order to document this, you need to obviously have the control plan, you need to have drawings, and you actually also need to include what is being implemented in the plan. So the first credit then, aside from the prerequisite, so the first credit is about assessing the site. It's like a site analysis essentially that you might do in a project to assess the site conditions before the design, to evaluate sustainable options and to inform your ultimate design. So here you're looking at the typical things that you might look at a site analysis, so the challenges or the features of the site, and that helps you to plan where you might put the building, considering open space or protecting native habitats and species, climate and rainfall, where site contamination might be, or if the site has been disturbed or developed on before, etc. So all of that needs to be assessed and surveyed and documented. That survey and documentation needs to include information on the topography of the site, on the hydrology of the site, so that would include any flood areas or wetlands, etc., and even to do with rainwater collection opportunities. The climate of the site, so the usual issues to do with exposure or sun angles, prevailing winds, etc. Climate data to do with precipitation levels, sunshine, cloud cover, all the usual stuff. Vegetation would look at the vegetation types that are there, significant trees that are there, is there any threatened or endangered species on the site. Soils would look at the kind of soil standard, what type of soil you have on site. Human use would be maybe things to do with views or what's adjacent to the site, so neighbouring properties, or is there any materials that could be reused or buildings that are being reused or dismantled, etc. And any health effects. So is there sources of pollution nearby, or is there a park nearby that would be a good source for um, a good opportunity for physical or mental health for the users of the project, etc. So it's a typical site analysis, but with very specific headings, I suppose, and things that need to be included. And you need to include how each of these aspects or features have been considered in the design, how they've been included in the design, or how they've been mitigated, whatever the outcome is, and you need to give reasons for why you're not addressing some or what you're doing about it each. So it's basically like a feasibility study of the site, documenting the decisions that arise out of that assessment, and for all of that you get 1 point. The second credit is about protecting and restoring the habitat on site. So obviously this is about conserving whatever natural areas or biodiversity or green fields already is on site, and then also about restoring any native soils or plants or hydrology in order to kind of improve the overall ecosystem of the site. So the requirement under this credit is to preserve and protect a minimum of 40% of existing green fields. So don't put any development or construction on those if you have such areas of green field. And then you've got another aspect to achieve, and you can either do it in two ways. The first option is to restore 30% of the total site using native or adapted vegetation, and also restore disturbed soils that can be vegetated. So after you've raked it all up, that you replant it with native species. And if you have a project that has a density of 1.5 floor area ratio, they can include a vegetated roof, and that can be an intensive or an extensive green roof. In the that roof can be included in the calculation, but to do that, the plants have to be native, and provide and promote biodiversity. The floor area ratio, again, a definition will be given in the manual, but it's similar to the plot ratio, so it's the total area of development over the area of the site. The second option then, if you can't do that or won't do that, is to basically pay out to suffer a penalty. So you have to donate at least 40 cent per square foot of the total site to a national or a locally recognised land trust or a conservation organisation. And you can see there that that's worth only 1 point, because obviously it's not as good as actually doing the work on site. Yeah. Then the third credit is open spaces, for which there's 1 point available, and that's to create kind of usable open space for biodiversity reasons, and for rainwater harvesting reasons, and also to lessen the heat island effect, but also just to provide places that would encourage social interaction, passive recreation, getting out and about and doing physical activity. So the requirement here is that the open and accessible space has to be at least 30% of the total site, where 25% of that must be vegetated or have an overhead vegetated canopy. And in this definition, turf grass doesn't count as vegetation. And the open space must be one or more of the following. So you have to have pedestrian orientated paving or grass. So although obviously you're going to have grass in it, you can't just include that as your 25%. It has to be other stuff. Or recreation orientated paving or turf, some kind of garden space with diverse year-round planting. So it's not just planted or coming to life in one season only, or some kind of garden space that's dedicated to food or community gardens, or it's a habitat that meets the criteria of the SS, the Sustainable Sites second credit, to protect or restore habitats. So, and it would also include some kind of elements of human interaction. You can include, depending if you have that density, that FAR, floor area ratio of 1.5, again, you can include the roof, 25% of it. The fourth credit is about the management of rainwater, and you get between 2 and 3 points for this. This has two aspects to it. You're trying to reduce the amount of rainwater runoff, first of all, and then you're managing whatever runoff is remaining. And the idea is that you're replicating somehow the natural hydrology or the water balance of the site based on how the site was before it was developed. So rainwater runoff is an issue there with kind of running off hardscape surfaces in the past. That would actually increases the water levels of water bodies that are near the site. It will lead to soil erosion, perhaps, compromises habitats, local habitats, etc. So what you're trying to do is reduce that. So you're managing it. There's two options in the requirement. You either manage it for the 95th, which is worth 2 points, or the 98th, which is worth more points because you're doing more, obviously, percentile of the rainfall event, and you use low impact development or green infrastructure. So that would be reducing the amount of hardscapes. You might have alternatives to hardscape. You might have a green roof, or you might have porous paving or grid pavers or suds. You could collect the rainwater, so that will reduce the runoff, or you could divert the rainwater to planted areas, again suds, that would filter and drain it back. If it's a project with a zero lot line, so the minimum FAR is 1.5, then you only need to meet the 85th percentile event. So it's a bit of a reduced requirement there. The second option to meet the requirement, which you get 3 points for, is to have the annual post-development runoff not exceed pre-development values. So you need to do some on-site testing for that. But essentially that you not made things any worse than they were when you got there or before you developed. The fifth credit is about reducing the heat island effect. So that's a microclimate effect where there's an increase in the temperature around the buildings, and that's created by waste heat from humans coming out of the buildings, but just how the building is operated, or it might be producing a lot of heat from its cooling system, for example, and also just the surfaces and the materials that the site and the project are made of that might absorb more heat than they reflect. When you have a microclimate effect like the heat island effect, not only does it increase the temperatures, which means that your cooling system needs to work harder, but it also can have an effect on kind of wildlife or habitats there that aren't used to those kind of higher temperatures. So that's why this credit is trying to minimize the effect of that. So there's two options to meet the requirement. You can either install heat island prevention measures, and they're defined in the manual for 50% of the non-roof area, so that's obviously anything on the ground and paving, etc., and for 75% of the roof area. So in the non-roof area, the options might be things to do with shade from plants or paving with an SRI of 33, for example. The SRI is the solar reflectance index. Or can also just be the SR, which is the solar reflectance. It depends on the material or what material it is, how it's specified. And they tend to be materials that are light coloured and they're reflective. So they'd reduce the amount of heat absorption. So obviously the more of those you use, light coloured paving, not dark coloured paving, etc. And that value would come with the product. It would be one of the ways that the product is described in the technical data. Then roof areas, you could have a vegetated roof, or again a roof with a reflective coating and the SRI value of 82, for example. So the manual goes through other options there. That's worth 2 points because it's obviously the better thing to do, and then you get 1 point if you just have at least 75% of the parking spaces under cover, and they need to be under cover by a 3-year aged SRI of at least 32. And that means that if its initial SRI is higher, let's say it's 60, that after 3 years it's at least 32. If you don't have the value for the 3-year deterioration value, then you need to meet, there's the initial SRI, it needs to be met over that period. You could have a vegetated roof, or you could have a kind of energy generation system, and obviously that's I suppose the less good option, which is the theme of all of these credits, gets less points. The sixth and final credit in sustainable sites category is light pollution reduction. This is about not only increasing the night sky access, so the lack of light pollution to enable you to see the sky, and improving nighttime visibility, but also to reduce the consequences of light pollution on both wildlife and people. It kind of looks at 3 main areas of light pollution. That's uplight, which is when you get that kind of artificial sky glow. Glare, so when you've got one area that's way brighter than another area and causes distress on your eyes. And then light trespass is that backlight, when light is kind of misdirected onto an adjacent site. So all of this causes issues for any nocturnal animals, but it also can disturb humans. It can disturb our sleep patterns, our melatonin levels, etc., our night vision, cause visual discomfort in people. So all of that is trying to be addressed in this credit. And it's not only about actually the health and well-being of the wildlife and animals, it's also reducing that need for artificial lighting, and then therefore reducing energy, etc., reducing costs. So to get this credit, there are requirements for both the uplight aspect and the light trespass aspect, and you can either use 2 methods of calculating. You can use the bug method, which is the backlight uplight glare method, or the calculation method, and again more detail is given in the manual. And you can use either of those or a combination of those to look at uplight and light trespass. So you need to deal with uplight, and you might decide to use the bug method for that, and when you deal with light trespass you might decide to use the calculation method for that. So it's up to you can mix and match those. So with the uplighting, the first option the bug rated method, there's a table again given in the manual, and you can't exceed some of the ratings. You can't exceed the ratings given in those tables, and as defined in that. And there's mounting distances and locations, etc. So there's a table of values that you can't exceed, or you can calculate the amount of lumens that you'd have, and then there's again a table about percentages that you can't exceed. Another aspect of that, this is internally illuminated exterior signage, so you can't exceed a luminance of 200 candelas per metre squared during the nighttime and 2000 during the daytime. And that concludes the fourth lecture to do with the sustainable sites category.